There's no holiday that's changed more over the course of history than Passover. The Passover that we know and that we'll celebrate at our Seders next week is totally different than the way it was meant to be or the way it started. Think about how Passover started. The Jews were leaving Egypt after 210 years of slavery, after 430 years of exile, and they were going free. And they were going home. And they were on their way home. And if it wasn't for a couple of sins, they would have been there in just a few weeks. Ended up being another 40 years, but they were free. They didn't write the Haggadah. The way that they used to do Passover, especially once they got to Israel, was that when it came time for Passover, everyone would buy an animal, they'd all meet in Jerusalem and have a big party and a huge barbecue. And that was Passover. Except there was one other thing you had to do. You had to eat matzah when you ate the meat, and a little bit of that Manischewitz red bitter herbs, the horseradish, you had to put a little bit of that on too. And that was it. Other than, tell the story of what's in the Torah. But there was no Haggadah, and Passover was a celebration. That's what a pilgrimage holiday was. Everyone went to Jerusalem to celebrate. But there was no Haggadah. The Jews went free from Egypt. If you date what most archaeologists do, the period of Moses, to about 1,500 years before zero. The Haggadah was written 1,600 years after that. Did you catch that? So for 1,500 years, Pesach was pretty fun. Well, what happened 1,500 years later? The Romans came, kicked the Jews out, burned down the Second Temple, and the Jews still had to figure out, how do we celebrate this holiday that celebrates our freedom now that we blew our freedom and we're slaves again to the Romans? And it was in that milieu of slavery that the Haggadah was written. The rabbis who wrote the Haggadah during the period of the Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud, listen closely to this. The rabbis who wrote the Haggadah about our great story of freedom were slaves to the Romans. Passover isn't a story in the Haggadah about being free. Passover in the Haggadah is a story of hoping to go free again. There's one prayer. If you were at the men's Seder, you know this. And if you weren't at the men's Seder, women, then we can't tell you the things that we said. Because what happens at the men's Seder stays at the men's Seder. But this part I will tell you. This will be a repeat for some of you, but it wouldn't kill you to hear it twice. There's one rubric of the Haggadah. All of it is written in Hebrew, the traditional liturgy, except for one part. There's one part, good, Bill? There's one part that is in Aramaic. And that's the prayer that's called Halach Ma'anya. You know this one? Halach Ma'anya di achalu. This is the bread of affliction that we eat. And what we say in that blessing, what we say in that prayer, is that this year we are slaves, next year we will go free. So why would such a prayer, talking about how we're slaves now, but next year we're going free, be in Aramaic? Because what is Aramaic? Aramaic is a combination of Hebrew and Arabic. It's a diaspora language. It's what happens to us, and it's what happens to our pure Hebrew when we get kicked out of our homeland. Remember what happened when we combined it with German? We got... Okay, good. Here's a harder one. What happened when we combined it with Spanish? Ladino. But when we combined it with Arabic, we got Aramaic. And so Aramaic represents what happens to us when we get kicked out of the land and we're not free. So the rabbis kept that one prayer in Aramaic in the Haggadah to remind us that at the time that this is being written, we're not free. And so when you go this week to your Seders, I used to think growing up, people brag about how long their Seders are. Actually, some people brag about how short their Seders are. I don't like those. But real Jews brag about how long their Seders are. And I never understood that because, growing up, our Seders would always be really fast, but we did everything. We didn't skip anything. We did the whole Haggadah, the conservative Haggadah, we did the whole thing. But the reason people brag about their Seders being long is because they don't just read the Haggadah, they teach about it. They talk about it. They explain about it. Because to just read the Haggadah, you miss a lot of what's going on. Well, what is the Haggadah? The Haggadah was the rabbis' efforts during slavery to give hope to their people that someday again they would be free from the Romans and rebuild Jerusalem. And if you look closely in the Haggadah, there are two Seders that are happening that have competing ideas. Two Seders that were going on the same time. Now we're talking about between the period of the year 100 CE and 130 CE. The Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. And the Jews weren't all kicked out from Israel at that time. Some still remained. And those who remained were trying to decide what to do. Should we revolt against the Romans? Should we just pray for salvation? What do we do? Ultimately, they decided to revolt. It was a terrible idea. It was crushed. And at that moment, they were all kicked out. But where we are when the Haggadah is written is in that moment where the rabbis are trying to figure out what's the message we want to give to our people in this really difficult time. And in that moment, there are two Seders of two of the most famous rabbis going on at the same time. The first one was a rabbi named Rabban Gamliel. Remember him? You'll see him in your Seder. His Seder was in Lod. If you know where Lod is, Lod in Israel is like where the airport is. That's Lod, the center of the country. But down the road, there was another Seder, and the people who went to that Seder wouldn't set foot in the Seder in Lod. And that was the Seder of Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak's a city in Israel today. In fact, it was one of the first cities to take a missile in the beginning of this war. But Bnei Brak is not far. It's towards Tel Aviv, but it's not far from Lod. And one group of rabbis was sitting at a Seder in Lod, and the other group of rabbis was sitting at a Seder in Bnei Brak, and neither of them would go to each other's Seders because they had a completely different idea on what should be preached to the Jewish people. Well, what were they saying at these Seders? At Rabban Gamliel's Seder, he told his servant, he had a servant, his name was Tavi. He said, Tavi, here's what I want you to do. Take the piece of meat and go out and roast it and bring it back to me. And then we're going to talk about the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering. You know the shank bone that you put on your table that it's hard to find, but you finally get one and you put it on your Seder plate? You know why that shank bone is there? It reminds us that we used to have to offer a special sacrifice called the Paschal offering. And Rabban Gamliel said, at my Seder, that's all we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about the laws of how you slaughter the animal and how you give it to the priests and how they take the blood and how you offer it. And it sounds like a Seder that nobody would want to go to. It sounds boring. Like this sermon. No, it sounds... You're with me. It sounds boring, though, to talk about those specific laws. Now, the problem with him telling his servant to roast his animal that they're going to eat for their Seder is, once the Holy Temple was destroyed, it was no longer legal to roast your animal. Because someone might think by roasting it, you were doing it the same way that they did in the Holy Temple, which wasn't allowed once the temple was destroyed. And so his roasting of the animal was reminiscent of what they used to do during the times of the temple. And that was so offensive that some rabbis wouldn't set foot in his Seder. I'm sure some of you would be equally disturbed at his chutzpah of his Seder. That was a joke. You wouldn't get it. You wouldn't care. All right. Now, what was going on at Rabbi Akiva's Seder? So, by the way, how do we know this about Rabban Gamliel? You'll get to the point in your Seder where it says, at his Seder, Rabban Gamliel used to say, anyone who doesn't point at the Pesach and the Moror and the Matzah hasn't fulfilled his obligation of the Seder. Now, we know Matzah and Maror from the Torah. The Torah tells us you got to mention Matzah and Maror and eat it. He adds Pesach. He adds Pesach once the temple's destroyed, because he's reminiscing about what Pesach used to be like, and he's yearning to the past. Then you're going to keep going in your Seder, and you'll get to another story that says Rabbi Akiva and his friends, and there's a lot you can learn about each one of them, but I don't have time to go into each one of them. But Rabbi Akiva and his friends, these other rabbis, would stay up telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling the story of the going out of Egypt all night into the morning until their students came to them and said, Higi Azman Kriyas Shema Shachrit. Rabbis, you're still talking about going out from Egypt. The time has come now for our morning prayers. You need to end your Seder. But what were Rabbi Akiva and his friends doing? They were talking about the story of going out of Egypt. Now, why? None of them were slaves. None of them were free men. They were all under the heavy thumb of the Romans. But the point of their Seder wasn't to yearn to the past like Rabban Gamliel was. The point of their Seder was to say, look, if God could take the Jewish people out of Egypt, if he could do all of these miracles to destroy the mighty Egyptian army and Pharaoh, if we pray hard enough, if we return to God, maybe he'll do the same for us. And these were two competing ideologies of what were going on at these two Seders that you'll read about in your Haggadah in just a few days. One Seder said, let's go back to the way it used to be. The other Seder said, we need to find a new way of doing things because what's going on now isn't working. But the truth is, we don't discard Rabban Gamliel. We still talk about the Pesach offering. We say Pesach, Matzah, and Maror to remember our history and our links to our past and the importance of our traditions. But at Rabbi Akiva's Seder, they said, tradition is well and good, but if we don't find a new way of adapting to the world we live in, we're never going to get back to our traditions or observing them any way that we like. Rabbi Akiva, unlike Rabban Gamliel, had a dream that someday a man named Herzl would present a new idea, that a poet named Chaim Nachman Bialik would write about those ideas, that a man named David Ben-Gurion and a woman named Golda Meir would implement them. Rabbi Akiva's vision was that one day, Jews would realize that though the Talmud did not sanction return to Israel, that the language in the Talmud that said the Jews shouldn't go back to Israel was meant for past generations. And it spoke to some people. It spoke to Rabban Gamliel. It spoke to those who opposed Herzl. But if there's one thing we know today, it's that Rabbi Akiva's dream won the day, and our people found a new way home. Think about this message of Rabbi Akiva. We're slaves again, but our people need hope. Our people, if they keep thinking about what they lost, they'll never move forward. And it seems maybe easy to say now, but it was just 80 years in our past that Jews were huddled in camps and ghettos, hanging on to every scrap of food and drip of wine in order to make their seders. And around those huddled flames, as one rabbi told his fellow Jews in Auschwitz, this is our bitter herbs. Our suffering, like Rabbi Akiva's, was real. But we endure, and we remember that our people survived the bitterest oppressions before, and so shall we again. Today, though missiles are falling and peace is not yet, we can safely assert that both Rabban Gamliel's and Rabbi Akiva's messages of Passover Seder held true. We did not give up on our sacred traditions in accordance with Rabban Gamliel. But as Rabbi Akiva hoped, we also found a new way to come home, to rebuild, and to pass the majesty of our tradition eternally from one generation to the next. It should be our prayer that as we sit down to our Seder tables in just a few days, we look back with awe at where we've come from, at the traditions that we've established, and we look to the future with even greater awe in knowing that our ancestors succeeded in passing these dreams on to us, and we continue to dream how we will pass them on to the future. Ken Yiratzon. May this be God's will. Amen.